Today's lecture is on the Transportation Revolution. Transportation Revolution is a term historians use to talk about the truly revolutionary changes in the transportation system in the 19th century. Really affect everything, the economy, mobility, and as we're going to see, it affects the way people live, the way they work, where they live. Very, very wide-reaching changes, and it's tied intimately with the market revolution. Transportation revolution in the 19th century tends to have two phases. One is the canal system. Canal boom lasts from 1825 to 1840, and then after 1840 there's a railroad boom. And the railroad has the same relationship to the economy in the second half of the 19th century that the automobile does to the first half of the 20th century, or information technology does today. It's the most important element of the economy, and it changes people's lives, and it also drives so many other elements in the economy. All these new businesses come about because of it. There are businesses that service the main businesses. There are new inventions that come about because of this leading technology. All of these side effects as a result of this major technological innovation. So, transportation revolution in the 19th century is two phases: the canals and railroads. We're going to look at them both today, and we're going to look at them in terms of how they affect Burlington, Vermont. And as it turns out, Burlington's a really good laboratory for us to talk about the transportation revolution. And this is a lecture I give at UVM all the time. I know some of you are all in all sorts of places today, but it's still going to be very, very useful for us today. Burlington was created by the transportation revolution. It's a little village in the middle of nowhere in 1820. As soon as the Erie Canal system is completed, Burlington begins to change dramatically in the second half of the 1820s, 1830s, 40s, and it becomes the place we know today. That's one reason that it's very, very useful for us. The other reason is there's so much of that Burlington that's left. When you walk around downtown, you can see the city that was built by the transportation revolution. Once you know what to look for, there are all sorts of interesting things to see in Burlington, and one of my hopes for this lecture is that those of you who are in town walk around and take a look and see how the place has changed. So we're going to talk about how the Erie Canal system affects Burlington's economy. Then we're going to look at Burlington a little bit, how it changes in terms of its work spaces and the way people work, its neighborhoods, its ethnic makeup. Then we're going to look at the railroad and how that affects Burlington, and we're going to end by considering how this is a new type of society that's a result of the transportation revolution in this city. First thing we're going to do is Burlington related, but it's also a bit of trivia, and it's about steam engines. Steam engines are part of the transportation revolution. They're related to the canal boom, in that they're water transportation, but they really affect the way rivers are used in America. Before the invention of the steamboat, the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, which drain, such a large part of the Trans-Appalachian West, that is the west east of the Mississippi River, and so important to transportation in this society. They're one-way streets. You can only take goods out. You can't take goods upriver. Going upriver is very difficult. The way people did it was they poled barges. They take barges to the side of the water and then pole it upstream. So you couldn't take large loads upstream. It's too difficult. And that means you really can't have full trade up and down the rivers. The steamboat changed that. Steamboats invented in 1807. Here's an image of the first steamboat. It's invented by a guy named Robert Fulton. And as it turns out, Fulton had a couple of assistants named Winans. And the Winans brothers moved to Burlington, Vermont shortly after that. And they bought the shipyard owned by the guy who lived in this house. This is the house of Gideon King. King Street's named after him in Burlington. This building's still there. And King had a little boatyard on the lake, and he made boats for lake transport. And he sells out to the Winanses in 1808, and his boatyard was just down the street. This is the intersection of King Street and Battery Street. This is a Battery Street view. And this is where the Winans brothers moved. They had a house where the Ice House restaurant is today, not the same building, and across the King Street pier, they had, where the Shanty restaurant is now, they had a boatyard. And in that boatyard, they built a very, very early steamboat, the Vermont, which appears in 1809. It's one of the first steamboats in the world. And that's where they built it. And they started a company, a steamboat company. And the Lake Champlain Transportation Company is a direct corporate descendant of that steamboat company, and you can make the case that the Lake Champlain Transportation Company's one of the oldest, maybe the oldest steamboat company in the world. Very, very interesting. All right, now to our main story, the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal's a New York State project, and it's a very, very visionary one. The idea is that they're going to tie the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, and they're going to do it through central New York. And the state of New York commits to this in 1817. Governor DeWitt Clinton's administration commits to this. And it's a very, very daunting thing. It's 340 miles across the state. It's got all sorts of engineering challenges. It's very, very difficult. Nobody's ever done a project like this before. But they take it on, and they successfully see it through. The Erie Canal's done in 1824. And it turns out to be a fabulous success. It lowers transportation costs by 90%, but that's kind of almost misleading, because what it really does is it changes the ability to transport things. You just couldn't take heavy goods across New York State before the Erie Canal. So it's not really a question of just lowering the prices, it's a question of making it possible. The Erie Canal success takes what had been, wilderness or very thinly settled areas, and makes places like Syracuse and Rochester and Buffalo into cities, major cities. It makes Albany a much bigger and more important place. It means that western New York's more easily settled. It allows settlers to transport themselves easily from the east into the Great Lakes. You can go by water all the way to Detroit from New York City after the opening of the Erie Canal. That means that the settlement of Michigan and Ohio becomes much easier. Tremendous effects from the Erie Canal system. Now, the Erie Canal opens 1824. 1823, there's another element to the Erie Canal that opens. You can see on the right side of the screen, there's a canal that connects Lake Champlain to the Erie Canal and the Hudson River, and that's called the Champlain Canal. It's another part of the Erie Canal system. The Champlain Canal opens the year before the Erie does, 1823. So 1823 is the year in which Burlington, Vermont goes from an isolated lakeside village connected to pretty much nothing, maybe Montreal, but not to point south at all, and after 1823, it becomes part of this vast transportation system. You can take something made in Burlington, Vermont after 1823, certainly after 1824 when the Erie opens, and you can ship it to Detroit. You can ship it to Rochester, any place along the canal. You can ship it to New York City, and therefore to the world. Burlington, Vermont gets connected to the world by water as of 1823, and it transforms this city. That's what we're going to be looking at in more detail. Here's the close-up of the New York Canal system. We can see the Erie Canal. The Oswego Canal here connects the Erie Canal system to Lake Ontario, and that's a way to bypass Niagara Falls. If you come down Lake Erie, rather than going over Niagara Falls, you go down the Erie Canal from Buffalo through Rochester and then up to Oswego, and there you are on Lake Ontario. It connects the Finger Lakes, and for our purposes, it connects Lake Champlain, all to the same system. Tremendous success. This is a close-up of the Champlain Canal, and you can see all of these locks. There are 11 locks along the Champlain Canal. And if you don't know how a canal works, a lock is a way in which you can keep the water level and still raise and lower the elevation of boats. It's a technical difficulty to making canals. The Erie has, I forget how many locks, and it's a huge engineering achievement, among other things. The Erie Canal is really an incredible thing. So that's the Champlain Canal, and you can see how it connects Whitehall, New York, which is the foot of Lake Champlain, all the way to Troy and the whole Erie Canal system, and the Hudson River. This is what it looked like. It wasn't very big in terms of its width, but it connects Lake Champlain to the world. This is what it looks like with water in it. It's not huge. This is a good view of a lock, by the way. What would happen is a canal barge would sail into that area. Those gates would close. You could raise or lower the water level within the lock. And then on the other side, there's another set of gates, and you'd open those when you had at the appropriate level, and it would continue sailing. Doesn't look like much, but very, very important. Okay, how does Burlington change? And the answer is it changes very considerably. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a little hike through Burlington and look at how it changes. Start out with this map. What we're going to do is start on the UVM green, which is on the far right of the screen. We're going to go down Pearl Street, which was, you can see it marked. It's the long street. Where do you expect it to be, from the top of the green all the way down to the Common, which is now Battery Park, and then we're going to go down what's marked as Water Street here, but that's Battery Street today, and we're going to look at some of the buildings and how they change and think about how Burlington changes. First thing to note is about the map itself. Pretty much the street layout is unchanged, except for where the mall is today. It's blocked off some of the streets on the northern side of the downtown, Cherry and Bank in there. But pretty much otherwise, the street layout hasn't changed that much. However, Burlington really isn't that densely populated here. I mean, there are entire blocks on this map where there aren't any buildings at all. Every building in the city in 1830 is marked on this thing, and you can see there are blocks where, like north of the Common there, north of Battery Park, entire blocks, nothing's there at all. There are blocks where there's only one house, and there are a lot of blocks where they're, very, very thinly populated. This is still a very small place in 1830. In fact, before 1830, Burlington has a street laid out in 1798. But before 1830, it's just a tiny little village. It's not even the biggest place in Chittenden County, something like 5th or 6th. It's way down the list in terms of population of towns in Vermont. It's a small place. It's a backwater. That changes, and it changes because of the Erie Canal. Let's go to the next slide. Here's what Burlington looks like as of 1848. You can see a very, very busy waterfront. There is, conveniently for us, a steamboat right in the middle of the picture here, and then in the skyline in the background you can see that dark building with the spire in the background. That is UVM. That's UVM's old mill. So you can see by 1848 Burlington's really developed into a much bigger and more densely populated place. Really can think about it, start to think about it in terms of a city. That's 18 years after that street map I showed you. The place has really grown, and it's grown because of the Erie Canal. Okay, let's look at how it changed. And by walking around in the little walk I described and looking at buildings, we can begin to see some of the ways in which Burlington changed. This is in the top of the UVM Green, almost, just a little ways down Pearl Street, 404 Pearl Street. House was built about 1824. That is just as the Erie Canal is opening. The Champlain Canal has just been open a year. And it was built by a guy named Truman Seymour. And Truman Seymour, you can see in the caption, was a wheelwright. That is, it's a guy who made wheels by hand. He made carriage wheels by hand. It's a difficult thing. It's a skilled art. You have to be an artisan to do it. It's a skilled trade. You have to be able to bend wood. You have to be able to bend it in such a way that it makes a circle, 360 degrees even. You have to be able to put iron hoops on those wheels. You have to build the wheels so that the weight it is distributed evenly through evenly made spokes. It's hard. It's a very difficult task. So Truman Seymour's an old-fashioned artisan making these things by hand. He has a couple of apprentices who work for him, and he has a little business, and he's prosperous enough in 1824 to build this house. And we're going to look at more of how artisans lived as we go down the street, because there are more on Pearl Street. So we're heading toward the lake. Pearl Street. A couple of blocks away is 220 Pearl Street, and this is a house just about the same size as Truman Seymour's, owned by this guy named Henry Whitney, and Whitney was a blacksmith, and this tells us a little more about the artisanal world, this world of handwork. What does it tell us? Well, one thing is Whitney's a blacksmith. His shop is about a block away, and that's indicative of how there's no industrial park, there's no industrial district in Burlington in 1824. People live and they work in the same neighborhood. Work and home aren't separated. You don't commute to work. Nobody can commute in those days, and that's part of the reason why. The other thing it tells us is a lot about the nature of the household. 17 people live in this household in the 1840 census. It's pretty crowded in there. But all of those people are not the children of Henry Whitney and his wife. In addition to their children and themselves, there are a number of apprentices. In other words, Henry Whitney's employees live in the family with him, and they're considered members of the family. Work and life are not separate the way they are today. You would, your employees, in his case his apprentices, were part of his household. He was morally responsible for them. He fed them. They would sleep in his home. They become part of the family. So the distinction between work and family isn't really there in this world either. Everything's connected. Work, family, the geography of home and work, it's all connected. And you don't divide your life into 8 hours for work and 8 hours where you can do what you want and then you go into your own home. Very, very different than today. And that's about to begin to change. And in Burlington's case, it's about to begin to change because of the Erie. Now, one more example of one of these artisan houses, just a little further down the street, 223 Pearl Street, is William Seymour's place. Seymour's a hatter, and you can see his hat factories across the street. Now, factory is too grand a term. His hat workshop is probably a better word. Again, work and home aren't separated. Seymour's doing pretty well. This is a substantial home, pretty big. But he has not gone off and built this house in a neighborhood for well-to-do people. He's right across the street from where he works. And this is how Burlington's economy is in the 1820s. Small household businesses with artisans hand-making things, and very limited production for a very local economy. That's how Burlington works in the 1820s. All right, now we're going to go all the way to the lake. We're going to start walking south along the lake on Battery Street. It used to be called Water Street. And we're going to see a very, very important home of a very, very important figure in this transformation of Burlington after the Erie Canal opens, and that's Timothy Follett. So here's our map of 1830 again, just to remind you where we were. We walked down all the way down Pearl Street. Now we're coming down Water Street, and we're going to hit Timothy Follett's house at the corner of College Street and Water Street, or today, it's still there, College Street and Battery Street. That's the idea, that the more a place looks like a Greek temple, the more it's likely to be Greek Revival House. So this is the grandest Greek Revival building in Burlington. That's a very successful guy. There he is. He had gone to UVM and was a lawyer, and he was a judge very briefly as a young man, but he quits being a judge and he goes into business. And he goes into the business of betting on the transportation revolution. Okay, what do I mean by that? Oh, before we get to that, here's a few series of maps to see his house. This is a map from, I forget, much later. Probably the 1850s, I'm not sure. And you can see at the top of the map, College Street, Water Street, that intersection, it's marked T. Follett. You can see the house, which is exactly where it still is, and in front of him is a yard that kind of opens up. And amazingly enough, that is pretty much unchanged too. I think it may be a little narrower now. So there's a close-up of, you can see College Street, Main Street, the square there, I think that's marked square, is now City Hall Park. You can see Church Street, and then on the left side, Timothy Follett. And one more look of the walk between the 2 blocks between City Hall Park, Courthouse Square, and his house. So that's where it is, and this is what it looks like from Battery Street. And you can see the lawn is maybe not quite as wide. Some of it's been turned into a parking lot on the right side of the screen here, but otherwise it's pretty much unchanged. This terraced effect of it cascading down the block from of College Street down to Water, that is still there. The terraces are still very much in evidence, and Follett apparently had some nice gardens out here, and it's a beautiful view, still a beautiful view from the upstairs, and if you can, it's very noisy there now, but if you can imagine a time before the internal combustion engine standing at that corner on a warm summer night, it must have been very peaceful and very beautiful. This is where he made his money, just 2 blocks away, down Battery Street, Water Street at the time. This is the corner of Water and King, and this is what's called today the Old Stone Store. Follett quits practicing law and he goes into business as a storekeeper. He buys the store and has a business trading there, and what the Old Stone Store is in the business is taking advantage of the Erie Canal trade. They would ship out things like Vermont lumber and import all kinds of stuff that people like molasses and sugar and rum that people can't grow in Vermont. So they're in the wholesale canal trade business, and they're very successful, and you can see that success in this building. The original building is only the part on the right. If you can draw a line almost right behind that tree there, you can see that this is 2 buildings in effect. On the right, there's a door in the middle and window on either side. Same thing for the second floor. And then on the left, we get a much bigger building with a lot more glass in the front. The part on the left was built second. The part on the right was the original store. Because they get successful in about 1827, they expand the building, they put a new roof over it, an attic that caps the whole thing, but only the right 2/5 of this building were the original building. So Follett and his partner, his name was Mayo, are very successful. They make a lot of money, and because they're so successful, they expand their store. And you can see on that entire block that there are buildings that come from this post-canal period in the 1830s. They were built as warehouses, and this is the block that's transformed, the first place in Burlington that's transformed by the Erie Canal system. It's another one, back to the same era, on the same block. And once you start looking for these buildings, you can spot them all over the place, and that whole block clearly just screams warehouse once you start looking for these older ones. Okay, now Follett is not done with the transportation revolution. He's making a lot of money based on the canal trade, and in 1840 or so decides to go into the business of building canal boats. They're paying a fortune to have their goods shipped. Why not just build the boats ourselves and own our own fleet, and then we can sell boats to other people too. So they go into the boat building business, and this is the dock right behind their building. This dock wasn't there in the 1840s. This is all filled in later. So the water comes up right behind their building, and they go into the business of making canal boats right there. This is the kind of thing they made. This is a reproduction made in the 1990s, I believe. The Lois McClure. It still hangs around Burlington. This Lake Champlain Maritime Museum owns it. Keeps it in Virgins, but they come up for extended periods to Burlington. And here it is sailing along. It's kind of like a schooner in this picture, but it's actually very tubby. It's very rectangular. It's basically a giant cargo container. You don't really want to use it in a storm. It's an unwieldy sailor. Another picture of an old-time version. But this is what makes it a canal boat. This is a hinge at the base of the mast. You would open up that hinge, and then you could lower the mast down onto the deck. And the reason they did that is that they would sail along the lake and take advantage of the wind, but when they got to the entrance of the canal, they couldn't sail anymore. The canal is too narrow, as we've seen. The canal also has bridges in plenty of places right over it, very low. So you got to turn this thing back into a shipping container that's going to be tugged by horses and mules, not sailing down the canal. And you got to get the masts out of the way. So it's built so the masts are hinged. You can open up, lower the mast, and turn this thing into a big cargo container as opposed to a sailing vessel. That's what it looks like with the mast down. So that's what it would look like when it was inside the canal. And it would be tugged rather than sail. This is what it looks like with the masts up. And this is a schematic drawing of it. You can see it doesn't have a keel, it has a centerboard. And that centerboard can be lifted because when you're on the lake, you want something that's going to give you a little more stability. You lower it in the lake, resist, the ship rolling too much, the boat, I guess I should say, rolling too much. But when you're in the canal, you don't want something scraping along the bottom of the canal, so you lift the centerboard up and it becomes a big, squarish shipping container. You can see the bows are pretty blunt here. And this is what it looks like below decks. It's really just a big open container. And it was built to fit exactly within one of these. You can see that the width of the canal boat and the width of the canal are almost exactly the same. There's 6 inches, only 6 inches of play on either side. In fact, the canal boat was built to fit as tightly as possible inside a lock. That was the limiting size of the canal boat. So it really is basically a shipping container. Another view of that slide we looked at earlier, Burlington waterfront in 1848. And on this slide, the far right is the area in which Follett and Bradley were doing business and building their canal boats. Same view today. Okay, Follett's still not done. He's in the canal boat business. He's a merchant. He begins investing. He becomes one of the major investors in a textile mill, the first textile mill built at Winooski Falls, just on Colchester Avenue below UVM. And what are they making there? They're making cotton. And where they're getting the cotton, it has to be shipped to them, and it's coming up the Erie Canal. So the cotton industry, the textile industry, at least as far as cotton's concerned, is a product of the Erie Canal, and Follett's investing in that. He also becomes president of the Merchants Bank in Burlington. What's the Merchants Bank? Well, the Merchants Bank is founded by a group of merchants who don't have sufficient access to capital. There's no banking system that can handle the new need for intense amounts of capital for these larger projects that these guys are taking on. So Follett helps found a bank, and it's called the Merchants Bank because it's founded by merchants. And its headquarters is still there on Battery Street, and they're right across the street from the Stone store. They're 2 blocks from Follett's house, right across the street from his store. And it's got this terrific building with these heavy granite columns here. It must have cost a fortune to build. And to me, it's another one that once you know what it was, I say, it makes so much sense now. It screams bank. It's so solid and strong, but it's also got this very impressive glass windows. It's mostly windows on the first floor because of the strength of these columns that hold the place up, and a very impressive building for its day. Look at those columns, really fantastic. Okay, so Follett is the classic example of Burlington, of a guy who believes in the transportation system, sees all the opportunities. He's like somebody who will invest in the internet, in the late 80s or something. Somebody who really has a vision about where this is going and all the opportunities it presents. So we're going to leave him for a little while. We'll get back to him in a while. But I want to talk now about how Burlington changes physically, geographically as a city. This is a block away from Timothy Follett's house. This is a corner of Main Street and Battery Street, right at the bottom of Main Street. We see these buildings. And what are these? These are tenements. These are small apartment houses built for the people living and working in the neighborhood. So let's talk about that. These neighborhoods change as they get so busy with the canal trade. They begin to be the commercial heart of Burlington. And there are a lot of people working there. And again, this is before anybody can commute. Everybody's on foot in these days, unless you own a horse and carriage, and nobody would downtown here, particularly the poorer people. So they live right where they work. And this becomes a very working class area. And people live in tenements, and these are these and ones on King Street we'll see in a second. They're the only survivors, and I think they're the survivors because these are very, very solid, well-made buildings. Look how square they are. Look at the foundation, how well built that is. I think that's what kept them there. So here's another one on King Street. This is even later 19th century building, and very, very substantial, fantastic. A roof. The slate roof there is very, very colorful, very intricate design, and that's why this one survives. So these are the only survivors of this working class district that develops in that area. And that neighborhood, King Street, Lower Maple Street, Battery Street, North Champlain, that neighborhood is still very much a working class neighborhood. And that's because of the people who move in there. Well, who are they? There's the map now. So we're talking about these few blocks right along the lake here. Water Street, Champlain Street, King Street, and then Wharf Street is now Maple. All of that section right in there. By the way, Main Street is called Fayette Street at the time. It's named after General Lafayette. Well, the neighborhood begins to change, and to talk about the change, we've got to look at some of the earliest buildings there. This is one of the earliest houses in Burlington, the house of Dr. John Pomeroy. It's built in 1798. Bricks just become available in Burlington about 1798. And Pomeroy was a physician. He moves to town in the 1790s. He lives in a log cabin until he builds this house. So he's really taken a step up in the world when he builds this place. And he spends the rest of his life in this house. He was a doctor in Burlington. He's also the first one to teach medicine at UVM. Pomeroy Hall is named after him. And he builds this elegant brick mansion. Look at that nice window above the oval window above the door. He builds this elegant mansion and lives out his days there. And then after he dies, his wife lives there as well. Well, when she dies, she's a very old lady when she dies, none of his kids take over the house. They don't want to live there anymore. And why not? Because this map from the 1870s tells us. Look at all those docks. A lot more docks than there are today in the 1870s. Burlington's downtown, its lakesfront is all built up. It's a very, very busy dock area, dominated by lumber yards in the 1870s, but that's not part of our story today. And you can see that the neighborhoods we've just been talking about are marked as either industrial or residential working class, residential working class. And that's what has happened to the neighborhood around the Pomeroy building. And it's happened by the 1840s, not just the 1870s. So that's why the kids, when their mom dies, don't want to stay in that house. It's not in a very good neighborhood anymore. What happens to that house? Well, it's bought by an Irish guy, and that leads me to discussion of the Irish. In the 1830s, all of the people beginning to move into Burlington and work on these dockyards, not all of them, but many of them, are Irish immigrants. The Irish potato famine starts in 1845, and between the 1830s and the mid-1840s, this trickle of Irish immigrants turns into a real flood, to the point in 1849 where Burlington is worried that it's getting overpopulated with these Irish immigrants, many of whom are malnourished and ill because of the famine, terribly impoverished people. And they take the step in 1849 of trying to keep some of these people out. So here's the Irish Ordinance of 1849. At the top it says, whereas the indiscriminate importation and landing at this port of foreign immigrants, subjects of Great Britain. Ireland was part of Great Britain at the time, was an independent country, so this is really the Irish they're talking about. In large and crowded masses, in which in which large numbers of immigrants are both paupers and diseased, and become a charge upon the town, and a cause of sickness, and a source of danger to the public health, we're going to do the following. So they appoint a physician. They say, secondly, masters of vessels arriving at this port from any port in Canada are forbidden to land or set on shore any foreign immigrant of Great Britain without the consent of the inspecting physician. 3, the physician will be at the docks. The boats have to come one at a time. 4, the inspector will not allow any such person as an Irish immigrant to land unless they appear to be in good health, unless in his discretion he deems it safe for the public health, and everybody else has to stay on board. So they're trying to control this flood of Irish immigration into Burlington by the late 1840s. They think they've really got a problem. They're all living in the neighborhood we've just been talking about and working down there. Well, so the Pomeroy House changes hands a couple of times, and in 1864 it's bought by the most successful Irishman in town, this guy named Patrick Kavanagh. Patrick Kavanagh had come to Burlington in the 1830s. He'd started to sell vegetables from a cart on the dock and fruits. He becomes a grocer, a very hard-working, entrepreneurial guy. He starts to buy real estate. He becomes a landlord in town, a landlord of the Irish working poor. Apparently he was a very kind-hearted man, and people loved him, and he'd let you slide on the rent if things were tough. Ends his life in this house. He buys this substantial house. It's now in an Irish neighborhood, but this is the home still of a successful man. And the transformation from the Pomeroy House to the Kavanagh House tells you a lot about the transformation of the neighborhood. So Burlington is beginning to have ethnic neighborhoods by the 1840s, and it's because of the Erie Canal. Here's Courthouse Square, City Hall Park today. In 1835, Nathaniel Hawthorne visits Burlington, and he goes to Courthouse Square. First he remarks about all the Irish in town. Man, there are Irish everywhere. And then he says, well, look, I come to Courthouse Square, and what do I find? A customs house. Burlington, that means customs duties are being paid there. It's where imports are coming in. Burlington is, in effect, in other words, the border with Canada. It's the point where the vast Erie Canal system meets Canada. That's why Burlington exists as a city. It's really the juncture between those two things. And Hawthorne says, and I come to downtown Burlington, I come to this park, and what do I find? I find Canadians, I find British officers, because Canada is still part of the British Empire at this point. I find tourists, I find French Canadians, and I find Yankees. There's all of these different types of people mixing in this place, and that's because this is where the trading's done. And he also says there's a customs house here, and he talks about how you can find Canadian money. He says that the goddess of liberty, who's on an American dollar, is made to kiss the King of England, because people carried both British and American money around in their pockets, and they used them interchangeably in Burlington, and this really strikes Hawthorne as something very significant. Okay, these neighborhoods are not all inhabited by houses like the Pomeroy House. There are slums that develop in Burlington, and by the Civil War, Burlington has a big slum problem. And this is a photograph from the 1930s of what those buildings look like. It's really a lot of poverty, and a lot of it is around the docks, and it's part of this segmentation of the neighborhoods. So we have these industrial neighborhoods, these commercial trading neighborhoods develop. We have ethnicity begin to affect neighborhoods, and we also have income changing the neighborhoods. That, in other words, rich people are starting to segregate themselves from poor people and from the working areas in town. Instead of having your shop across the street where you work and you come home for lunch and your apprentices live with you, now if you're a well-to-do merchant or business owner in Burlington, you move a few blocks away. You start to move uphill toward the university and build a nice neighborhood around the university. And here's an example of that. This is a guy named George Peck. Peck is another downtown merchant. He's in the wholesale pharmacy business. He supplies, drugs, and he's a contemporary of Timothy Follett's. But he doesn't build his mansion anywhere near Follett's. He builds it uphill. Follett builds his house. When he builds his house in 1841, that neighborhood is already beginning to change. It's becoming much more rough and tumble and dockside and industrial. Peck goes the other way. He goes up the hill toward the university. His house is on College Street, and when you walk from the university down College Street downtown, you pass this house. It's at the intersection of College and Hungerford Terrace. This was the house of one of Burlington's most substantial mansions. Another couple of views of it. This is where his business was, on College Street, just down the street from his house. I think that's the building where the Burlington Free Press is now, or maybe one block up from it. I'm not positive. Called Peck's Block. And you can see the drugstore right next to his company. And back to his house again. This is the side that's facing the lake. The front of it faces College Street. The side faces downhill, and that's where he puts his beautiful Greek columns, Doric columns in his case. Now this house has been modified a lot. There are all these additions built on the back, and the third floor was put on later. So it's changed quite a bit, and it's no longer as elegant. It hasn't survived as well as the Follett house has. But you can see underneath all the additions this very substantial Greek Revival building. In the front, with that the light over the front door, I think maybe original. Very, very striking, and that's just another one of these little indications. If you keep your eyes open in Burlington, you can see so many of these kind of elegant elegant reminders of the past, or survivors of the past, I should say, still in town. Okay, now let's talk about the railroad. Railroads are built, first invented in the 1820s, invented in England. The first one in America is built about 1830, the Baltimore and Ohio, and by 1840 or so, people realized the railroad works. You know, you can ship goods long distances very reliably for low prices. Railroads have all sorts of advantages over canals. Railroads don't freeze in the winter. You can run a railroad all winter long. Canals freeze. Railroads can go up and down mountains. Canals can't. So if you're going to invest a lot of money in a transportation system, you're much better off building a railroad than you are a canal. So after 1840, people stopped building canals and they put their monies into railroads. And here's a little chart about how substantial the growth of railroads are. They really grow exponentially between the 1840s and the 1890s, not just the 1860s. And here is a map of how it's so much easier to get around. In 1800, to go from New York City out to western Michigan would take you 6 weeks, and by 1830 you can make the same trip in 3 weeks. The distances begin to be much easier to conquer after the transportation revolution, and the railroad's a huge part of that. Here's the rail system by the 1860s. You can see the entire northeastern United States, all the way out to the Mississippi River, is pretty well covered by railroads. And you can see, by the way, if you look at Vermont, there's a track going through Burlington, Vermont, up the eastern side of Lake Champlain by the 1860s. So let's talk about that. That was built in 1849, and it was called the Rutland and Burlington Railroad Company. And look at the signature of the president on the stock certificate. It's Timothy Follett. In the 1840s, people begin to try to raise money to build a railroad in Vermont. They do it by selling stock. And Timothy Follett is the president of this new railroad. He's still betting on the transportation revolution. So what's he got going in the 1840s? He's got his original store. He's got his canal boat building business. He's got his investments in the textile industry. He is president of the bank. And now he's president of the railroad. All of his activities are products of the transportation revolution. So he's president of this new railroad. And look, the tracks go right behind his building. That's not a coincidence. This is the heart of the transportation revolution in Burlington. Block over, the railroad tracks cross the docks of the ferry company, where the ferry, the railroad, the Erie Canal meet. That is the transportation revolution in Burlington, and all of it's still there. The evidence of it is still there. It's really cool. Where's the rail yard? The rail yard is just across the street from Follett's building. Across Battery Street is his bank office. Across King Street is the rail yard. He owns, why is it there? Because Follett owns 60 acres south of his building, and that 60 acres is still the rail yard. You can see it here where it says Depot, corner of King there, and Battery. South of that is the rail yard. It's still the rail yard in Burlington. You know, why isn't it $1 million condos? Because it's always been the rail yard. Here's the view from the rail yard, looking one way up to his building on King Street. Turning around, same spot, looking the other way, there's the rail yard. So, all of the transportation system revolution in Burlington comes through Timothy Follett. That's one of the oldest rail buildings in Vermont, built for the Burlington Rail Yard in the 1840s. That building dates to 1849. And there's one more image of it. The depot. Okay, there's the railroad they built. That green line, it's a Rutland Railroad. Everybody calls it the Rutland. You can see it's called the Rutland and Burlington Railroad on the original stock certificate, and it runs to Burlington. Burlington's the northern terminus of the railroad. They have plans to connect up to Canada and Montreal, but they don't, and that turns out to be a big mistake. There's also a competitive railroad that's built, the Central Vermont. Central Vermont basically runs down the route that Route 89 follows now, goes through Montpelier and then White River Junction, and then it connects with other railroads in New Hampshire. And the competition is too much for the Rutland Railroad. Let's get that map. Timothy Follett's final bet on the transportation system loses. And he loses this house. He has to sell this house 10 years after he built it. And he has to sell it for half of what he paid for it. And to add insult to injury, he winds up selling it to the president of the Central Vermont Railroad. So it's a disaster for him. His family loses everything. His sons go back to the stone store and start over again. And that's kind of a good lesson for us too, because you don't always win your bets on these new economic ventures. Sometimes you lose. All right, now let's end with this slide. This is John Gray's carriage shop on Champlain Street, just a few blocks from Follett's house. And it was built about 1848, as you can see. And in 1870, there's an inventory for this building. Gray's son was running it by that time. He did $16,000 worth of business, and he had 61 carriages and 16 sleighs in stock. Well, so what? Well, this building becomes a lot more interesting to us if we understand who John Gray was. Remember that first slide I showed you, the slide of Seymour's house, Truman Seymour's house. Truman Seymour's wheelwright, making wheels by hand. John Gray was one of Truman Seymour's apprentices. So here we are, 25, 30 years later, and Gray is no longer in the business of making wheels by hand, but he's still in the transportation business. But he's got a factory, and he's turning out carriages. He's now a manager in a factory. And he's got a lot of employees making carriages. That is, in a nutshell, the change that Burlington brings, comes about in Burlington due to the Erie Canal system. We now have factories instead of workshops. We have managers and employees instead of artisans and workers living together. We have different ethnic groups. We have segmented neighborhoods. We have rich people separated from the poor. All of these changes are due, these social changes, these economic changes are due to the improvement of the transportation system and the bringing of the market revolution to Burlington. So that's it for today's lecture. We'll be back talking about politics soon.